Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most bizarre, twisted cases of the past decade. And I'm telling you right now, this one is wild. We're talking about a woman who staged her own kidnapping, blamed it on two Hispanic women who didn't exist, and had an entire community searching for her for 22 days while she was. Well, you'll see. This is the story of Sherri Papini, the California supermom, whose disappearance gripped the nation in 2016. And when I say gripped the nation, I mean it was everywhere. Good Morning America, People magazine, GoFundMe campaigns raising over $50,000. Her husband on national television begging for her safe return. And then she came back. Beaten, branded, chain marks on her wrists, a 15-pound weight loss, and a story about two Hispanic women who held her captive and tortured her. Except, none of it was true. So grab your tea, get comfortable, because we're about to unpack how a seemingly perfect California mom orchestrated one of the most elaborate hoaxes in recent memory, why she did it, and how it all came crashing down thanks to DNA evidence and one very persistent FBI agent. Let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning. Who was Sherri Papini before she became a household name? Sherri was born Sherri Grief in 1982 in Redding, California, a small city in Northern California, about 160 miles north of Sacramento. If you've never heard of Redding, you're not alone. It's one of those towns where everyone knows everyone, and not a whole lot happens. The kind of place where a missing person case would absolutely dominate the local news. Sherri grew up in what seemed like a pretty typical middle-class family. Her parents, Richard and Loretta Grief, were both educators. By all accounts, she had a normal childhood, cheerleading, good grades, blonde hair, blue eyes. She was pretty, popular, and knew it. But here's where it gets interesting. Even back then, according to people who knew her, Sherri had a flair for drama. And I don't mean like, oh she liked theater class. I mean she liked being the center of attention. She liked having people worried about her, focused on her, talking about her. In high school, she dated a guy named David Dreyfus. And according to him, and we'll get more into this later, Sherri had a pattern. She would disappear. Not like, kidnapped disappear, but just vanish for a day or two without telling anyone where she was going. And then she'd come back and act like it was no big deal. Like, oh, I just needed some space. Red flag number 1. After high school, Sherri worked various jobs, nothing particularly notable. She worked at a local AT&T store for a while. She was a stay-at-home mom for a bit. But what really seemed to define her was her relationship status. Sherri was always in a relationship. Always had a boyfriend. Always had someone paying attention to her. In 2006, she met Keith Papini. Keith worked in electronics, specifically in the Best Buy electronics department, classic early 2000s job, right? He was a few years older than Sherri, and by all accounts, he was completely smitten with her. Like, head over heels, this woman is perfect, I would do anything for her level of smitten. They got married in 2009, and honestly, from the outside, they looked like the perfect couple. They had 2 kids, Tyler, born in 2010, and Violet, born in 2013. They lived in a nice house in Mountain Gate, a little community just outside Redding. Keith had a good job. Sherri was a stay-at-home mom who ran a blog about motherhood and was super active on social media. And let me tell you, Sherri's social media presence was very curated. We're talking perfectly filtered Instagram photos of her kids, inspirational quotes about being a mom, pictures of her morning runs. She presented herself as this absolutely flawless supermom. Blonde, fit, beautiful, devoted to her children and her husband. The kind of woman who would make you feel bad about yourself if you followed her on Instagram, you know what I mean? Like, wow, she looks like that at 6 a.m. before her run? I can't even find matching socks. But behind the scenes, things weren't quite so perfect. According to people close to the family, Sherri and Keith's marriage had its issues. Money was tight. Keith worked long hours. Sherri was home with 2 young kids all day, and if you've ever spent time with toddlers, you know that can feel incredibly isolating. There were also reports, later confirmed, that Sherri had been in contact with ex-boyfriends. Texting them, flirting with them, keeping those doors open, just in case. And one of those ex-boyfriends? His name was James Reyes. And he is going to become very important to this story. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about November 2nd, 2016, the day Sherri Papini vanished. November 2nd, 2016. It's a Wednesday. A pretty normal day in the Papini household. Keith leaves for work in the morning. Sherri is home with the kids. According to her routine, she typically goes for a jog around midday while the kids are at daycare. This is completely normal for her. She runs almost every day. She's very into fitness, very into maintaining that picture-perfect image. So around 2 p.m., Sherri drops the kids off at daycare and heads out for her jog. She's wearing pink running pants, a pink tank top, and she has her iPhone and earbuds with her. She's jogging along the Sunrise Drive area, which is a pretty rural road near their home. Trees, not a lot of houses, pretty isolated. And then, she's gone. Keith gets off work around 5 p.m. and goes to pick up the kids from daycare. When he arrives, the daycare workers tell him, "Hey, Sherri never picked them up." Keith's confused. That's not like her. Sherri's always on time. She's a very punctual person, very scheduled. He tries calling her. No answer. He texts her. No response. Now Keith's worried. He drives home thinking maybe she's there, maybe her phone died, maybe there's some explanation. But when he gets home, Sherri's not there. Her car is in the driveway. The house is empty. Keith immediately knows something is wrong. This is not like Sherri. She would never just disappear without telling him, without picking up the kids. She's a devoted mother, that's literally her entire identity. So Keith does what anyone would do, he calls the police. But before he does that, he does something kind of interesting. He uses the Find My iPhone app to track Sherri's phone. And guess what? Her phone is pinging from a location about a mile away from their house, along Sunrise Drive, right near where she would have been jogging. Keith drives over there immediately. It's starting to get dark. He's looking around, calling her name. And then he finds it, Sherri's iPhone, lying in the grass on the side of the road. The earbuds are tangled up with it, like they'd been ripped out. But there's no sign of Sherri. No blood, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Just her phone and earbuds. Now Keith is panicking. He calls 911. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office responds immediately. This is a small community. When a young mother goes missing, especially under circumstances like this, they take it seriously. They search the area. They bring in search dogs. They interview neighbors. They put out a missing person alert. And here's where the media gets involved. Keith Papini is beside himself. His wife is missing. His kids are asking where mommy is. He has no idea what happened to her. So he does what a lot of people do in 2016, he goes to the media. He does interviews with local news stations. He puts out a statement describing Sherri, 5 feet 3 inches, 100 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes. He describes what she was wearing. He begs for anyone with information to come forward. And the story explodes. Think about it, this is 2016. We're in the middle of a lot of national news about missing women, true crime podcasts are starting to blow up, and here's this picture-perfect blonde mom who vanished while jogging in broad daylight. The media loves this story. Within days, it's national news. Good Morning America covers it. The Today Show covers it. Sherri's face is everywhere. People are making Facebook groups to help find her. Volunteers are organizing search parties. Keith goes on ABC's 2020 and gives this heartbreaking interview where he's crying, saying things like, "I just want her to come home. Our babies need their mom." He talks about how Sherri is the love of his life, how she would never just leave, how something terrible must have happened. And America ate it up. People were obsessed with this case. There were theories everywhere. Was she abducted by human traffickers? Was she murdered? Did she run away? Was Keith involved? That last one is important because, statistically, when a woman goes missing, the husband or boyfriend is usually the first suspect. And the police absolutely looked at Keith. They questioned him multiple times. They searched his phone records, his computer, his financial records. They even gave him a polygraph test. He passed. Keith Papini was not involved in his wife's disappearance. He was genuinely devastated and had no idea where she was. So if Keith didn't do it, who did? The sheriffs put out a description of a vehicle that was seen in the area around the time Sherri disappeared, a dark-colored SUV. They asked anyone with information to come forward. They set up a tip line. They followed up on hundreds of leads. But there was nothing. No witnesses. No evidence. No body. No ransom demand. Nothing. Sherri Papini had vanished into thin air. Days turned into a week. A week turned into 2 weeks. The community held vigils. Keith and Sherri's family put up billboards with her face on them. A GoFundMe campaign was started to help with search efforts. It raised over $50,000. Everyone was asking the same question: where is Sherri Papini? And then, on November 24, 2016, Thanksgiving morning, she came back. Thanksgiving morning, 4:30 a.m. A woman is driving along Interstate 5 near Yolo County, California, about 150 miles south of Redding. It's dark, it's cold, and she's driving along when suddenly, she sees something on the side of the road. It's a person, a woman, flagging down cars. The driver pulls over and is immediately shocked by what she sees. This woman is emaciated, covered in bruises, her hair is cut short and uneven, she has a chain around her waist, and her hands are zip-tied behind her back. She's wearing a white men's t-shirt and sweatpants that are way too big for her. She looks like she's been through absolute hell. The driver immediately calls 911. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrive. The woman is crying, shaking, barely able to speak. And then she says it. "I'm Sherri Papini." The entire scene is chaotic. Paramedics are trying to assess her injuries. Police are trying to get information from her. And Sherri is sobbing, saying she was kidnapped, she was held captive, she escaped. They rush her to the hospital. Keith is immediately notified, his wife has been found alive. Now, imagine being Keith in this moment. For 22 days, you've had no idea if your wife is alive or dead. You've been on national television begging for her return. Your kids have been asking where mommy is. And now, suddenly, she's back. Keith races to the hospital. When he sees Sherri, he later describes it as the most heartbreaking thing he's ever seen. She's lost 15 pounds, which, remember, she was only 100 pounds to begin with. She's covered in bruises. She has a brand mark on her right shoulder, like someone burned her with something. There are ligature marks on her wrists and ankles from being restrained. Her hair has been chopped off unevenly, like someone took scissors to it without caring what it looked like. Her nose is broken. Keith is horrified. The doctors are horrified. The police are horrified. And then Sherri starts talking. She tells them she was kidnapped by 2 Hispanic women. She describes them in detail. One was older, maybe in her 40s, heavy-set, with long dark curly hair and thick eyebrows. The other was younger, late 20s or early 30s, thin, with straight black hair. Both had their faces partially covered with cloth. She says these women pulled up next to her while she was jogging, grabbed her, threw a bag over her head, and forced her into a dark-colored SUV. She says they took her to an unknown location. She never saw where because they kept her blindfolded most of the time. She says they kept her in a room, chained to something, barely fed her, and beat her repeatedly. She says they would blast music loudly so no one could hear her scream. She says they burned her with something. That's where the brand mark came from. She says the older woman was the aggressive one, always hitting her, always yelling at her in Spanish. The younger one barely spoke but was complicit in everything. Sherri says she has no idea why they took her. They never asked for ransom. They never sexually assaulted her. They just kept her and abused her. And then, on Thanksgiving morning, for reasons Sherri couldn't explain, they let her go. She says the younger woman drove her in the SUV, threw her out on the side of Interstate 5, and drove off. That's when she flagged down the driver who found her. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, wait, that story doesn't make any sense, you're not alone. The police thought the same thing. But here's the thing, Sherri had injuries. Real injuries. Bruises, the brand mark, the broken nose, the weight loss. She looked like someone who had been held captive and abused. So the police had to take her story seriously. They interviewed her multiple times. They brought in sketch artists to draw the 2 Hispanic women she described. They put out those sketches to the public. They asked for anyone with information to come forward. The case was now officially a kidnapping investigation. And the media went insane. Sherri Papini was the victim of a horrific abduction. She survived 22 days of captivity and torture. She was a hero. She was brave. She was strong. Keith did interviews where he talked about how proud he was of Sherri for surviving, how grateful he was to have her home. He thanked everyone who had searched for her, who had donated to the GoFundMe, who had kept the case in the public eye. But behind the scenes, investigators were starting to notice some things that didn't add up. First of all, Sherri's injuries, while certainly real, were inconsistent with her story. The brand mark on her shoulder? It was superficial, like a first-degree burn. Not the kind of deep burn you'd expect from someone being tortured. The bruises? They were consistent with self-infliction or someone else inflicting them, but they weren't severe. The broken nose? It could have been broken recently, but it also could have been broken weeks earlier and just looked bad because of swelling. And the biggest red flag? Sherri's DNA. When Sherri was found, police collected DNA evidence from her clothing. Remember, she was wearing a men's t-shirt and sweatpants when she was found, not her own clothes. So whose clothes were these? The DNA on the clothing came back as male DNA. Not female. Sherri had claimed she was held captive by two women. So why was there male DNA all over her clothing? The police asked Sherri about this. She said she didn't know. Maybe the women had a man with them? Maybe they borrowed the clothes from someone? She didn't have answers. The police also looked at her injuries more closely. They brought in medical examiners and forensic specialists. And what they found was interesting. The injuries were real, but they were staged. The brand mark on her shoulder? It was made with a tool, yes, but it was done superficially, almost like someone wanted it to look bad without actually causing serious damage. The bruises? Many of them were in places where someone could easily inflict them on themselves. The broken nose? It was broken, but it wasn't consistent with being punched repeatedly. It looked more like it was broken once, deliberately. And then there was the weight loss. Sherri claimed she was barely fed during her 22 days of captivity. But 15 pounds in 22 days? That's less than a pound a day. It's significant weight loss, sure, but it's also consistent with someone who voluntarily restricted their eating, not someone who was starved. The police started to suspect that Sherri Papini was lying. But they didn't have proof. Not yet. For the next few years, the case went cold. Sherri went back to her life, well, sort of. She and Keith and the kids moved out of their house in Mountain Gate because of all the media attention. Sherri struggled with PTSD, according to Keith. She had nightmares, anxiety, panic attacks. She saw therapists. She was on medication. The police continued to investigate, but they had no leads. The sketches of the two Hispanic women led nowhere. No one came forward with information. There were no similar abductions in the area. It was like Sherri's kidnappers were ghosts. But the FBI didn't give up. One agent in particular, Special Agent Christopher Averill, became obsessed with this case. He knew something wasn't right. He knew Sherri was lying. He just had to prove it. So he went back to the DNA evidence. Remember, there was male DNA on Sherri's clothing when she was found. The FBI ran that DNA through every database they had, CODIS, the FBI's criminal DNA database, missing persons databases, everything. And for years, they got nothing. No hits, no matches. But then, in 2020, they got a break. Ancestry DNA and 23andMe had become huge in the late 2010s. Millions of people were submitting their DNA to these websites to learn about their heritage and find relatives. And law enforcement had started using these databases to solve cold cases, most famously, the Golden State Killer case. So Agent Averill decided to try something. He took the male DNA from Sherri's clothing and ran it through GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people can upload their DNA results from sites like 23andMe. And he got a hit. The DNA matched a man named James Reyes. James Reyes, age 37, living in Costa Mesa, California. No criminal record, seemingly a regular guy, but when the FBI looked into him, they found something very interesting. James Reyes was Sherri Papini's ex-boyfriend. They had dated years ago, back before Sherri met Keith. They broke up, but they had stayed in touch over the years. Facebook friends. The occasional text. Nothing serious, or so it seemed. The FBI brought James Reyes in for questioning. And at first, he denied everything. He said yeah, he knew Sherri, they used to date, but he hadn't seen her in years. But the agents pressed him. They told him they had his DNA on Sherri's clothing from when she was found. They told him they knew he was involved. They told him he could be charged with kidnapping if he didn't cooperate. And that's when James Reyes broke. He told them everything. Sherri Papini had called him in late October 2016. She told him she needed to get away from her husband, that she was in an abusive marriage, a complete lie, by the way. Keith was never abusive, and that she needed a place to stay for a few weeks. James, still having feelings for his ex-girlfriend, agreed to help her. He drove up to Redding from Southern California. On November 2, 2016, the day Sherri disappeared, he picked her up near her house. She deliberately left her phone on the side of the road to make it look like she'd been abducted. And then she stayed with him for 22 days, in his apartment in Costa Mesa. She wasn't chained up. She wasn't starved. She wasn't tortured. She was just hanging out, watching TV, eating his food, sleeping in his bed. According to James, Sherri was the one who wanted to make it look like she'd been kidnapped. She asked him to help her create injuries to make her story believable. She asked him to cut her hair. She asked him to hit her. He said he refused to do that, but she may have hurt herself. She even asked him to brand her with something. He used a hockey puck that he heated up and pressed against her shoulder. And the whole time, she was texting and communicating with him, planning her return. On Thanksgiving morning, James drove Sherri from Costa Mesa back up north to Yolo County. He dropped her off on the side of Interstate 5, and she staged the whole being found scene. James Reyes had no idea that Sherri was going to blame her disappearance on two Hispanic women. He thought she was just going to say she'd escaped from an unknown abductor. When he found out she'd blamed it on two innocent women based on their race, he felt horrible. But he didn't come forward. Not for years. Not until the FBI found him. When the FBI heard this story, they knew they had her. Sherri Papini had faked her own kidnapping. On March 3, 2022, more than 5 years after her disappearance. Sherri Papini was arrested at her home in Redding, California. She was charged with 34 counts of mail fraud, because she had fraudulently received victim compensation funds, and 1 count of making false statements to a federal law enforcement officer. The arrest made national headlines. Remember, this was the woman who had been on Good Morning America, who had been called a hero, whose story had captivated the nation. And now she was being arrested for lying about the whole thing. Keith Papini was blindsided. He released a statement saying he had no idea Sherri had faked her kidnapping, that he believed her story, and that he was filing for divorce. The public reaction was brutal. People who had donated to her GoFundMe felt betrayed. The community of Redding felt humiliated. They had spent weeks searching for her, putting up billboards, holding vigils. Law enforcement was furious. They had wasted thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars investigating a crime that never happened. And perhaps most disgusting of all? Sherri's lies had contributed to racial stereotypes and prejudice. She deliberately described her fake kidnappers as Hispanic women. She gave specific details about their appearance. She perpetuated a racist narrative about dangerous Hispanic women preying on white women. In a time when we're already dealing with so much racial tension and discrimination, Sherri Papini weaponized race to make her lie more believable. And that's unforgivable. Sherri initially pled not guilty. She maintained her story. She said she was telling the truth and that everyone was lying. But in April 2022, faced with overwhelming evidence, James Reyes's testimony, the DNA evidence, phone records showing she had contacted him, financial records showing she had received victim compensation funds, Sherri changed her plea to guilty. In court, she finally admitted it. She faked her own kidnapping. She lied to law enforcement. She lied to her husband. She lied to the entire country. But even then, she tried to minimize what she did. Her lawyers claimed she had been suffering from depression and anxiety, that she wasn't in her right mind, that she made a terrible mistake. The prosecutors weren't buying it. They pointed out that Sherri had meticulously planned every detail of her hoax. She called James Reyes weeks in advance. She staged the scene of her disappearance. She created injuries to make her story believable. She stuck to her lie for years, even when federal agents questioned her repeatedly. This wasn't a cry for help. This was a calculated, deliberate fraud. In September 2022, Sherri Papini was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. She was also ordered to pay $309,686 in restitution, covering the costs of the investigation, the victim compensation funds she fraudulently received, and the money donated through GoFundMe. 18 months. That's it. For faking a kidnapping, wasting law enforcement resources, perpetuating racial stereotypes, traumatizing her family, and lying to the entire nation. A lot of people felt like that sentence was way too lenient. But that's what she got. Sherri served her time in a federal prison in Victorville, California. She was released in August 2023 after serving about 12 months. She got time off for good behavior. And now? She's living quietly somewhere in California. Keith divorced her and has full custody of their 2 children. Sherri is not allowed to profit from her story, no book deals, no movie rights, nothing. But the question remains, why? Why did she do it? Prosecutors and psychologists have speculated. Some think Sherri has a personality disorder, possibly narcissistic personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder. People with these disorders crave attention and will go to extreme lengths to get it. Others think Sherri was trying to escape her life. Maybe she was unhappy in her marriage. Maybe she felt trapped being a stay-at-home mom. Maybe she wanted excitement, drama, something to make her feel alive. Or maybe, and this is the theory I find most compelling, Sherri Papini simply wanted to be famous. She wanted to be the center of attention. She wanted people talking about her, worrying about her, caring about her. And for 22 days, she got exactly what she wanted. But the cost? Her marriage, her relationship with her children, her reputation, her freedom. Was it worth it? Absolutely not. The Sherri Papini case is a cautionary tale about the dangers of social media, the obsession with perfection, and the lengths some people will go to for attention. It's also a reminder that not everything is as it seems. The perfect mom with the perfect life and the perfect Instagram feed? She was living a lie. And when that lie was exposed, everything came crashing down. So that's the story of Sherri Papini, the woman who faked her own kidnapping, blamed it on 2 women who didn't exist, and fooled the entire nation. Until she didn't. If you made it to the end of this, thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something, or at least found this story as wild as I did. Take care of yourselves, be kind to each other, and remember, if something seems too perfect, it probably is. Good night. Story 2. When you first hear the name Madeline Soto, it has a softness to it. The kind of name you'd expect to see written in looping handwriting on the corner of a school project, or on the back of a bright pink birthday card. She was 12 years old, living a life that, from the outside, seemed steady, familiar, and comfortably ordinary. And it's that very ordinariness that makes the story of her disappearance in Central Florida feel so unsettling. Because when the structure of a routine collapses, even slightly, the impact can ripple through an entire community. It began on a Monday, the kind that feels barely awake, where the sun rises slowly and the world takes a moment to catch up. Madeline had school that day, and like most kids her age, mornings were predictable. Clothes set out the night before. Backpack by the door. Small rituals meant to keep the day on track. But somewhere inside that routine, something went wrong. When the usual drop-off didn't go as planned, when school staff realized she hadn't walked through the doors, and when the hours passed with no sign of her, the quiet hum of everyday life shifted into something sharper. Something that made people stop what they were doing and start asking questions. Teachers noticed. Administrators made calls. And soon her mother reported her missing, triggering the kind of response that, in Florida, moves fast, because authorities know exactly how crucial those early hours are. But even within that rapid response, there was confusion. Details didn't line up neatly. Stories shifted, and investigators began to sense that the situation wasn't as simple as a child walking off or taking a wrong turn. It felt off, like a picture frame slightly tilted on the wall. Nothing dramatic at first glance, but undeniably wrong once you noticed. By midday, local news stations had picked up the story. Neighbors refreshed social feeds, volunteers prepared to search, and underneath it all was that one universal fear, the idea that a child, who should have been sitting in class or eating lunch with friends, was simply gone. In these moments, when the community takes its first collective breath and realizes something is terribly wrong, a story begins. Not the sensational version that headlines chase, but the human one, the one built from concerns, questions, and a hope that grows more urgent with every passing hour. When the first official alerts went out about Madeline's disappearance, the atmosphere in her Florida community shifted into something quiet and heavy, like the stillness before rain. People paused, not with panic, but with concern, the kind that settles softly, urging everyone to pay a little more attention than usual. And in that softened hush, the search for Madeline began. Detectives arrived at the school first, speaking in low tones as they walked through hallways just starting to fill with afternoon sunlight. They checked entrances, exits, and camera footage, the kinds of early steps that help form a timeline. But even as they worked, there was an unmistakable sense that the usual answers weren't coming. The school day had gone on as normal, unaware that a child expected to be there never arrived. Outside, officers gently widened the search area. They looked along sidewalks children often walked, near bus stops, and in open areas where students sometimes waited for rides. Volunteers moved slowly, scanning the ground for anything out of place while keeping their voices soft, almost as if not to disturb the warm Florida air. This wasn't the frantic kind of search you see in movies. It was measured, deliberate, and thoughtful, the kind shaped by people who genuinely hope a child will simply appear, safe and unharmed. But while the community moved outward, investigators began quietly looking inward. They asked themselves the kind of questions that aren't dramatic, but necessary, the ones that help determine whether a disappearance started out as an accident, a misunderstanding, or something more complex. They reviewed routines, morning schedules, and the last interactions anyone remembered. And in doing so, they noticed gentle inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite land where they should. These weren't revelations. They were more like faint echoes, early hints that something deeper might be unfolding behind the scenes. Through the afternoon, families in the area kept their children a little closer. Teachers checked attendance lists twice. Neighbors left porch lights on, even though it wasn't yet dusk. It became one of those days where everyone feels quietly connected, not through fear, but through shared hope. And as night approached, with the sky turning a soft shade of blue, the search took on a different rhythm. Flashlights replaced sunshine, voices lowered even further, and underneath it all, one simple wish lingered gently in the air, that Madeline would be found soon, and that the world would make sense again. As night settled over the town, the quiet hum of normal life mixed with a subtle tension, not sharp or alarming, but enough to make people notice small things they might usually overlook. Streetlights cast soft pools of golden light, and the air carried that calm Florida warmth that makes everything feel familiar, even when the day had been disrupted. In these soft hours, neighbors whispered to one another, sharing updates, and checking in, each conversation filled with care and quiet concern. For the investigators, the evening was a time for reflection. Notes were reviewed, timelines rechecked, and phone calls quietly made. Everything had to be precise, but the pace was patient, not rushed. It was as if the day's sunlight had given way to a more contemplative rhythm, a rhythm that allowed questions to emerge gently, without the harshness of panic. And these questions were simple, yet essential. Where had Madeline been last? Who had seen her that morning? What small detail might have been missed in the day's first hours? Meanwhile, in homes near her school, parents thought of the familiar routines, the packed lunch, the carefully chosen outfit, the cheerful goodbyes at the front door. They imagined their own children walking the same sidewalks, and the sense of vulnerability that comes with small lives navigating a big world. It was not fear meant to alarm, but a calm awareness of how fragile daily routines could be, and how quickly they might shift. Community members began to gather in small, gentle ways. Some walked slowly along the usual paths children took, their eyes scanning, their hearts quietly hoping. Others stayed in their homes, leaving porch lights on, offering soft thoughts and quiet prayers that might carry through the night. It was a shared attention, soft and persistent, that made the whole town feel connected in its care. Even as questions lingered, there was a subtle undercurrent of hope. It wasn't the bright, loud hope that leaps from headlines, but a quiet, patient kind, the hope that grows steadily in the background, like a gentle tide. And as the night deepened, that hope wrapped itself around families, neighbors, and investigators alike. Everyone seemed to understand, in their own way, that the next day might bring answers, and that holding on, calmly and carefully, was all anyone could do in the meantime. The following morning brought a soft, pale light over the town. Dew clung to the grass, and the distant sounds of birds offered an ordinary backdrop to an extraordinary day. For investigators, this new day was an opportunity to build on the quiet discoveries of the previous hours. Nothing rushed, nothing harsh, just patient observation and careful note-taking. Every small piece of information mattered, no matter how minor it seemed. Detectives spoke with people who had crossed paths with Madeline that morning, listening carefully, asking questions in gentle tones. Teachers, neighbors, and friends recalled fragments of routine. A backpack slung over a shoulder, a fleeting smile, a wave goodbye. It was in these tiny recollections that patterns began to emerge, subtle and quiet, pointing investigators toward the most likely paths she had taken. There were no dramatic confrontations or sensationalized moments, only a steady, methodical pursuit of understanding. Meanwhile, the search continued. Volunteers moved slowly through parks, along sidewalks, and near local businesses, their eyes scanning for any hint of a clue, their movements unhurried and deliberate. They whispered to one another softly, coordinating in a rhythm that felt almost meditative. It was an organized, gentle persistence that carried a quiet reassurance. The community was watching, caring, and committed to helping. As hours passed, the investigators also began reviewing digital records, phone logs, social media activity, and other accessible data, carefully piecing together a timeline. Every detail, even something as small as a missed text or an uncharacteristic route, was treated like a puzzle piece. It wasn't about creating fear or drama, it was about understanding a day that had started so normally, only to unravel unexpectedly. And throughout the town, people carried on with soft attentiveness. Parents walked children to school, neighbors exchanged quiet words on porches, and everyone seemed slightly more aware of the fragile threads that connect daily life. The tension in the air wasn't sharp or alarming, it was more like the low hum of concern, a persistent reminder that one missing child could affect an entire community. By the evening, as sunlight faded into a calm Florida twilight, the search continued with patience and care. The community, bound together by shared hope and quiet determination, seemed to breathe as one. And through it all, there remained that gentle wish, that Madeline would be found, safe, and that the day-to-day rhythms of the town could, slowly, return to their peaceful cadence. The days that followed Madeline Soto's disappearance settled into a quiet rhythm. There were no sudden twists, no loud announcements. Just steady, patient work. Investigators followed leads carefully, checking and double-checking each piece of information, always moving deliberately, like a gentle tide shaping the shoreline over time. Nothing was forced. Everything was approached with care and attention. Neighbors continued to support one another in small, meaningful ways. Some walked familiar streets, softly calling out her name, while others left notes at local shops or in community centers, reminders of a child who had touched their lives in subtle ways. It was a slow, collective effort, one built on hope and a gentle insistence that every possible avenue be explored. Detectives reviewed schedules and routines, looking for patterns in the ordinary. They noted where Madeline usually walked, the paths she took to school, and even the little routines she had with friends and family. These small details, normally overlooked in the rush of daily life, became central to understanding the bigger picture. Each careful observation was a thread, weaving together a tapestry that might reveal answers in time. At home, families reflected on the fragility of everyday life. The breakfast table, the walk to school, the casual exchanges on the sidewalk, all the small moments that usually go unnoticed, suddenly carried a new weight. In quiet conversations, parents spoke of awareness and care, not fear. It was the kind of reflection that builds empathy, a gentle reminder that daily routines are precious, and children's safety is a shared responsibility. Through it all, the community held on to hope. It wasn't loud or desperate, it was calm and persistent, like a soft flame flickering steadily against the dark. Volunteers, neighbors, and investigators alike moved with patience, allowing the search and investigation to unfold naturally, step by careful step. And as evening approached, the town seemed to exhale quietly. The search might pause for rest, but the thoughts, hopes, and attentiveness of the community remained. Beneath the surface of daily life, everyone shared a gentle understanding that a child missing touches more than just one family, it touches the rhythm of an entire town. And in that shared care, in that quiet vigilance, there was a steady, comforting presence, like the soft lull of waves on a calm shore, carrying with it the hope that answers would come, and that peace, in time, could return. As the search stretched into another day, the town seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm of patience. Streets were the same, familiar sounds echoed in the background, distant laughter, the hum of passing cars, the gentle rustle of trees swaying in the Florida breeze. Yet beneath the ordinary, there was a soft current of attentiveness. People noticed details they might have overlooked before. A forgotten backpack along the sidewalk, a bicycle leaning against a fence, footprints along a familiar path. Investigators continued their work methodically, moving slowly, speaking in low tones, and making careful notes. Every observation was gentle but deliberate, each question asked with calm precision. They checked timelines, revisited statements, and reviewed the smallest clues, knowing that understanding often emerges quietly, step by step, rather than in sudden bursts. Volunteers walked the neighborhoods at a measured pace, scanning streets and parks, calling out softly for Madeline. Their movements were calm and thoughtful, not frantic. There was an almost meditative quality to it, a steady rhythm that allowed hope to exist alongside careful observation. And in this quiet persistence, the town itself seemed to breathe with gentle expectation. Families at home held on to small rituals, maintaining daily routines while also carrying a quiet vigilance. Parents reminded themselves to be present, to notice little things, and to check in on neighbors and friends. Children continued their days with gentle guidance, unaware of the deeper investigation unfolding around them. This duality, of normal life alongside attentive care, gave the community a soft strength, a patient resilience that didn't need urgency to be meaningful. Evening brought its familiar calm. Soft twilight stretched across the town, painting streets and rooftops in muted shades. Lights flickered on inside homes, while outside, volunteers slowly concluded another day of searching. Despite the uncertainty, there was an underlying sense of continuity, a belief that the community's quiet attentiveness mattered, that each careful step contributed to understanding and, perhaps, eventual resolution. In these hours, the town's focus was not on drama or fear, but on steady, patient hope. Every voice, every small action, every gentle thought carried the same quiet intention, that Madeline would be found, safe and unharmed, and that the rhythm of ordinary life could gradually return. The search continued, calm and measured, with the soft assurance that sometimes hope itself is the most profound form of patience. As the days slowly unfolded, the search for Madeline Soto continued with careful attention, but it was in the small, quiet moments that hope quietly persisted. Investigators and volunteers alike had learned that not every discovery comes in a sudden rush. Sometimes, it arrives subtly, a forgotten item, a fleeting memory, a detail mentioned in passing, and yet, these small pieces can gently guide the path forward. Detectives revisited familiar routes, tracing the places Madeline might have passed that morning. They spoke softly with neighbors and friends, encouraging them to share observations, no matter how minor they seemed. In this patient, methodical approach, nothing was too small to consider. Each detail, each recollection, was treated with care, as if the cumulative weight of these quiet discoveries could slowly illuminate the bigger picture. Meanwhile, the community remained closely knit in its support. Parents kept their children a little closer, while neighbors exchanged thoughtful words, shared quiet reassurance, and sometimes simply sat in presence, reflecting on the situation together. These gestures, though gentle, were deeply meaningful, a soft reminder that caring can take many forms, and that every mindful action adds to the collective hope. At times, investigators would pause to step back, reviewing all the information gathered in soft reflection. No one rushed. There were no dramatic confrontations, no startling reveals, only steady, deliberate consideration. They examined timelines, double-checked routines, and sought connections that might otherwise go unnoticed. This quiet diligence was not about urgency, it was about persistence, a calm persistence that slowly built toward understanding. Even as night approached, with the sky deepening into shades of blue and the air cool and still, the town maintained its gentle rhythm. Porch lights glowed softly, and the occasional passing car hummed quietly along familiar roads. Volunteers concluded their search for the evening, yet their careful attentiveness lingered, like a soft echo across the community. In these moments, the story of Madeline Soto was not one of chaos or alarm. It was a story of patience, quiet observation, and subtle hope. The threads of everyday life, though interrupted, continued to weave a tapestry of care, a tapestry in which every small action, every thoughtful observation, and every shared concern contributed to the gentle, steady belief that answers would come, and that peace could gradually return to the town. As the search for Madeline Soto continued, the community settled into a soft rhythm of quiet vigilance. Life went on around the search, but there was a subtle layer of attentiveness, like a gentle hum in the background that reminded everyone of the child still missing. The streets, usually filled with the sounds of everyday activity, now carried a slower pace. People noticed the little things: a backpack left by a fence, a stray bicycle near the park, footprints fading into soft earth. These were small signals, almost imperceptible, yet they mattered profoundly to those who were watching. Investigators moved with calm deliberation, revisiting familiar locations, reviewing statements, and carefully tracing possible paths. There were no loud announcements, no sensational headlines, just steady work, day by day, step by step. The careful accumulation of observations, the gentle gathering of facts, became the foundation for understanding the events that had disrupted a once ordinary morning. Each small clue, each repeated memory, was treated with patience and respect, like pieces of a quiet puzzle. Community members also contributed in ways that were subtle but meaningful. Parents walked with heightened awareness, checking on children and neighbors. Friends and neighbors exchanged soft conversations about routines, about what they had seen, and about the gentle hope that carried through every action. Even small gestures, leaving lights on at night, softly calling out Madeline's name, or offering a quiet word of reassurance, became threads connecting the town in shared care. Evenings brought a sense of calm reflection. The golden light of sunset softened the edges of rooftops and sidewalks, and the gentle rustle of trees filled the air. It was in this quiet that people held their thoughts, hopes, and questions. There was no urgency in these reflections, only a patient awareness that sometimes the process of understanding, of piecing together details, moves slowly. And in that slowness, there is room for hope, for care, and for thoughtful attention. Through it all, the town seemed to breathe with a shared understanding that patience is not inaction, and vigilance is not worry. It is the gentle commitment to look, to notice, and to care, day after day. And within that quiet persistence, there remained a steady wish that Madeline Soto would be found safe, that answers would eventually come, and that the rhythms of everyday life could, slowly and softly, return to their peaceful cadence. As the days stretched on, the town maintained a steady rhythm of quiet support. People moved through familiar streets with careful attention, mindful of small details they might normally overlook. There were no dramatic confrontations, no loud proclamations, just a gentle attentiveness, a soft insistence that each person's actions mattered. In this way, the community itself became a quiet guardian, attentive and patient. Volunteers continued their slow, deliberate searches. Walking paths and sidewalks, scanning parks and open spaces, they moved with calm determination. Their voices, when they called out Madeline's name, were soft, measured, and full of hope. Each step, each careful observation, was part of a collective effort built on patience rather than urgency. And though the search might seem invisible to those passing by, it carried a quiet weight, a sense that every gentle action contributed to something larger than any one person. Investigators also maintained a soft, steady pace. They revisited earlier leads, checked in with families, and followed the gentle traces of information that emerged over time. Timelines were reviewed, routines carefully mapped, and statements cross-checked. In these quiet hours, the work felt like tending to a delicate puzzle, one in which every piece, no matter how small, could eventually reveal a clearer picture. At home, families reflected on the fragility of daily routines and the care that surrounds children's lives. Parents reminded themselves to observe little changes, to notice subtle details, and to keep a quiet awareness of their surroundings. Children moved through their days with calm guidance, and neighbors shared soft reassurances, connecting through simple, thoughtful gestures. In this gentle attentiveness, the community found a measure of strength. As evening fell, the town seemed to pause. The sky took on soft hues, lights glimmered warmly through windows, and the air held the gentle rustle of trees. The community's quiet hope lingered, persistent and patient, carried in every step, every observation, and every whispered name. It was not loud or forceful, but steady, a calm presence in the background of everyday life. Through this gentle vigilance, the people of the town quietly reaffirmed one belief: that patience, care, and attentiveness could create space for understanding, and that even in uncertainty, hope can exist as a soft, enduring thread. They waited calmly, believing that answers might come, and that peace, slowly and gently, could return. As the days turned into a quiet rhythm of searching and observing, the town seemed to move in unison with a calm purpose. There was no urgency in the streets, no loud proclamations, only a soft attentiveness that carried through every neighborhood. People walked familiar routes, keeping watch over ordinary places, playgrounds, sidewalks, parks, their actions gentle but deliberate. It was in this quiet persistence that hope remained alive. Investigators approached their work in the same steady manner. Each conversation, each review of details, was measured and calm. They revisited routines, retraced steps, and carefully documented small observations. Nothing was forced, nothing rushed. Instead, they allowed the facts to emerge naturally, understanding that clarity often comes through patience and careful attention rather than haste. Community members contributed in subtle ways. Parents kept their children close, neighbors checked in softly with one another, and volunteers moved through their assigned areas with slow, mindful steps. Even when progress was unseen, there was a sense that each small action mattered, that every gentle observation and quiet effort contributed to the larger picture. At home, families reflected quietly on the fragility and beauty of everyday life. Morning routines, small acts of kindness, and fleeting moments with children took on a deeper significance. These reflections were not fearful or anxious, rather, they were soft reminders of care, presence, and the shared responsibility of community. The day-to-day rhythms carried a newfound attentiveness, each gesture echoing the hope that Madeline would be found safe. Evening arrived with its familiar calm. The sky softened into muted shades, porch lights glimmered gently, and the town exhaled into the quiet of night. Volunteers concluded another day of searching, but their dedication lingered as a quiet presence. Investigators reviewed their notes, reflected on leads, and prepared for the next day's work, each step deliberate and careful. In this patient rhythm, the story of Madeline Soto was carried gently through the town. It was a story not of alarm, but of persistence, care, and calm hope. Through quiet vigilance and shared attentiveness, the community maintained a steady thread of optimism, allowing hope to remain soft, enduring, and ever-present. As the days slowly passed, the town's quiet attentiveness became a steady presence, like the gentle hum of a familiar song. Streets carried the usual sounds of life, but with a subtle layer of care: neighbors noticing small details, families walking with thoughtful awareness, and volunteers moving deliberately, step by patient step. It was a soft rhythm, one that emphasized hope without urgency, observation without alarm. Investigators continued their work methodically. Each conversation, each review of timelines, was approached with patience and careful consideration. They revisited familiar places, double-checked details, and quietly followed leads as they emerged. There were no dramatic confrontations or startling discoveries, only steady progress, built from the small pieces of information collected carefully and thoughtfully. It was the kind of work that demanded attention to the subtle, a soft diligence that, over time, could reveal clarity. In the community, people shared quiet gestures of support. Porch lights were left on in the evening, soft calls for Madeline's name echoed gently through familiar streets, and neighbors checked in with one another in thoughtful ways. Even the smallest actions carried meaning, reinforcing a sense of togetherness. The town had become a quiet network of care, each person contributing in subtle ways to a shared hope. Families reflected on the rhythm of daily life, recognizing the small, meaningful routines that connect them to one another. The simple moments, a morning goodbye, a hand held, a shared word of encouragement, took on a gentle significance. These reflections were calm and thoughtful, not urgent or fearful, and they reminded everyone that care and attention, even in quiet forms, have great power. As night fell, the town seemed to exhale softly. Street lights cast warm glows on familiar paths, the air carried the soft rustle of leaves, and the world felt calm, even amid uncertainty. In this gentle quiet, hope persisted, patient, enduring, and soft. It was carried in every step taken, every observation made, and every thoughtful gesture extended. Through these days of quiet vigilance, the story of Madeleine Soto was shaped not by chaos or alarm, but by calm attention and patient care. It was a story of gentle perseverance, a collective, mindful hope that, in time, would guide the town toward understanding, reassurance, and the peaceful rhythms of daily life. In the following days, the town continued to move with gentle attentiveness. Life went on, but beneath the ordinary sounds of footsteps, cars, and the rustling of trees, there was a subtle layer of careful watchfulness. People observed details that might have gone unnoticed before: a misplaced backpack, a fleeting glimpse of something unusual along a familiar path, the faintest sign that could help guide the search. Investigators maintained a deliberate, measured approach. Each interview, each review of schedules, and each examination of evidence was conducted calmly, with patience and focus. They retraced Madeleine's possible routes, spoke softly with neighbors and friends, and followed small clues wherever they led. There were no sudden conclusions, no loud proclamations, only steady, thoughtful progress. Every tiny observation was treated as significant, contributing quietly to a broader understanding of the day she went missing. Volunteers continued their careful searches, moving slowly through familiar neighborhoods, parks, and sidewalks. Their pace was unhurried, their voices soft when calling her name. Even the most routine actions, scanning a playground, checking along a path, pausing to observe subtle changes, became meaningful in the larger rhythm of the search. In this deliberate calm, the town found a shared sense of purpose. Families at home carried on with their routines while remaining mindful. Parents were quietly vigilant, checking in on children and neighbors, while children continued their days with calm guidance. The subtle attentiveness of the community created a gentle rhythm, one that balanced ordinary life with a quiet hope that Madeleine would be found. Evening arrived with the familiar soft light of twilight. The sky turned gentle shades of blue and pink, while streetlights glimmered warmly along familiar streets. Volunteers wrapped up their day, investigators reflected on the accumulated details, and families settled into the comforting cadence of home. The quiet patience of the community, and the steady work of those searching, became a calming presence, a soft reassurance that each careful action mattered. In these quiet moments, the story of Madeleine Soto unfolded slowly and gently. It was not a tale of chaos or alarm, but of calm persistence, patient observation, and enduring hope. The town moved forward softly, step by step, each action and thought contributing to a collective rhythm of care, and a gentle belief that understanding and peace would eventually return. As the search for Madeleine Soto continued, the town's rhythm remained gentle and deliberate. There was no rush, no chaos, only soft attentiveness. Neighbors watched quietly, families moved thoughtfully through their daily routines, and volunteers walked familiar paths with careful steps. In this measured pace, the community became a network of quiet support, each person contributing in small but meaningful ways. Investigators continued to follow subtle clues, piecing together details with patience. Conversations were calm, notes carefully reviewed, and timelines revisited. They spoke softly with those who had seen or interacted with Madeleine in the hours leading up to her disappearance, seeking clarity in the smallest observations. Nothing was overlooked, no detail too minor, for even subtle recollections could illuminate the path forward. Throughout the town, people carried out small gestures of care. Porch lights glimmered in the evening, gentle calls of Madeleine's name echoed softly along quiet streets, and neighbors checked in on one another with understated warmth. Each action, while gentle and unobtrusive, reinforced the collective hope that she would be found safe. At home, families reflected on the fragile beauty of everyday routines. The morning goodbye, the walk to school, the shared laugh over breakfast, each ordinary moment was quietly treasured, reminding everyone of the importance of mindfulness, care, and presence. These reflections were calm and thoughtful, carrying a sense of patient awareness rather than fear. As twilight descended, the town seemed to exhale softly. The warm glow of lights across familiar streets and the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze created a soothing backdrop. In this quiet, hope remained persistent and steady. Every step taken by investigators, every careful observation by volunteers, and every small gesture by neighbors contributed to a collective sense of purpose. Through these soft, deliberate actions, the story of Madeline Soto unfolded slowly, gently, and patiently. It was not a tale of chaos or urgency, but one of calm perseverance, shared attentiveness, and enduring hope. The town moved forward softly, step by step, sustaining a quiet belief that understanding, reassurance, and peace would eventually return, and that even in uncertainty, care and patience could guide the way. As the days unfolded, the town continued in its soft rhythm of care and attentiveness. Streets carried the familiar sounds of life, but over them lingered a gentle quiet, a layer of mindfulness that came from shared concern. People moved thoughtfully, noticing details they might once have overlooked. A backpack left along a sidewalk, a bicycle resting against a fence, a shadow shifting softly in the park. Each observation, no matter how small, was meaningful in the slow unfolding of understanding. Investigators remained deliberate in their work, reviewing statements, retracing steps, and following leads patiently. Every detail was treated with care. Conversations were quiet, notes were carefully organized, and timelines revisited with gentle attention. There was no rush, no sense of pressure, just steady diligence, the kind that allows clarity to emerge naturally, piece by careful piece. Volunteers continued their searches, moving slowly through familiar neighborhoods, parks, and school routes. Each step was thoughtful, each observation deliberate. Even the softest action, noticing a small item, scanning a hidden corner, or quietly retracing a familiar path, became part of a collective rhythm of hope and care. The gentle, shared purpose bound the town together, reinforcing that even in uncertainty, patience and attentiveness mattered. Families maintained their daily routines, balancing normalcy with quiet vigilance. Parents walked children safely to school, checked in on neighbors, and offered gentle reminders of mindfulness and awareness. Children carried on their days with calm guidance, unaware of the subtleties of the ongoing search. The everyday rhythms of life, paired with soft attentiveness, created a steady sense of continuity in an otherwise uncertain time. As evening fell, the town exhaled into a calm twilight. Porch lights glimmered softly, trees rustled gently in the breeze, and streets held a peaceful quiet. In these moments, hope remained steady and patient. It was not loud, urgent, or frantic. It was soft, enduring, and deliberate, carried in the small gestures and careful observations of those who cared. The story of Madeline Soto, though uncertain, moved forward with patience and gentle persistence. It was a story not of chaos, but of quiet perseverance and shared attentiveness. The town's soft, steady rhythm created a comforting belief that eventually, clarity would come, that understanding would grow, and that peace, slowly and gently, could return. If you've been following Madeline Soto's story, consider subscribing for more gentle true crime narratives designed to guide you calmly into sleep. Like the video to support the channel, and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. Your quiet connection matters.